Hello everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you guys back to another English video for our channel of Jóvenes Peregrinando. In today's video, we're going to be continuing with our series called Studies of the Brit Hadasha, where we are going to be analyzing chapters 13 and 14 of the Good News of Matthew. Today's video is titled Parables of the Kingdom to feed us with the instruction and not to sink in the nations. Starting off with the first parable that we're going to read in chapter 13, verses 3 to 9 say, "And he told them many things in parables, saying, A sower went out to sow, and as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path, and the birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground, where they did not have much soil, and immediately they sprang up, since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Verse 9, He who has ears, let him hear. As we have studied before, Yeshua was doing many miracles for the people. This is the reason why in this chapter it begins by saying that large crowds were going after Yeshua, although in the majority of these people, they only went for their own benefits, since they saw him as a source of healing, freedom, or sustenance. Yet we are going to be able to read later on within the other chapters that these people didn't want a commitment with the Eternal Father. They only wanted a personal benefit from Yeshua. The main reason of all these miracles and wonders that Yeshua would do within his ministry was to conduct the message of Teshuvah, also known as repentance. And throughout these messages, the people were able to return to the Father. But how I said later on in this Good News of Matthew, we're going to be reading how many of these people didn't want to return to their Creator. For this reason, it is why we read that Yeshua starts to teach to the large crowds in parables. In that way, only the true believers would be able to understand the true message behind these parables. And we are going to be reading about this in verse 13 and 14. Let's remember that in previous chapters we have studied about the difference between the disciple, the true disciple, and the follower. Yeshua, in that chapter that we studied about the difference between the disciple and the follower, Yeshua said that the follower remains while he receives what he wants, such as his miracles, his blessings, his physical healing, etc. But when he perceives something that does not please his ego, such as an exhortation to change the way he lives, or an exhortation to live in obedience and holiness away from all type of transgression, then that is where that person, that follower, turns away because he or she is not willing to change their sinful life. However, Yeshua said that the true disciple, even if correction rebukes him to put his flesh and desires to death, he or she does not deviate from the path, but on the contrary, they remain in the Messiah's teaching because he or she is willing to change. In other words, it is willing to depart from all evil path in order to live according to the will of the Eternal Father. And this is the reason why only the true disciples were allowed to know the mysteries of the kingdom. For those who may not know what a parable is an earthly story that illustrates a heavenly or spiritual truth. In the Hebrew word for parable is mashal, which means comparison or parable, although it is also frequently translated as a proverb. In other words, These parables require the listener to investigate or go furthermore in order to understand its true meaning, since it contains hidden teachings and or messages. In these verses, we can read about the parable of the sower. This was the first parable that the Messiah taught to the public, and therefore I imagine that when people heard about this parable, they probably wondered what Yeshua wanted to mean by saying this parable. And within this parable, Yeshua mentions four different types of land in which the sower sowed the seeds. For people who have knowledge of sowing, they can understand that it is a difficult or even impossible for the seeds to bear any fruit if the seed lands in a place where it is not suitable for that seed. Since in these lands, or in the path, the first land that Yeshua mentions, there are birds that come and eat these seeds. Or, for example, there are also people or animals that may pass or step through this land, and therefore the seed dies. On the other hand, Yeshua also mentions about the land that are little deep and full of stones. Although the seed can germinate, however, the sun dries it out because it does not have a firm root that constantly nourishes it. And generally, the land is usually dry. Another type of land that Yeshua mentions within this parable is a land full of thorns. And because even if the seed has some type of growth within the thorns, Yeshua says that in the end, it will end up being suffocated because it does not have the ideal conditions for the development of a seed. At the end of this parable, we can read that Yeshua mentions the importance that the seed can only be sown in good soil, which consists that it is a deep and it retains nutrients, it is easy to work with, and it also has a good drainage system. With this, the soil can retain the seed to finally bear its good fruit. The hearers of this parable could not understand these words because their vision was earthly and tangible. This is something that is very common in humanity, because if we put ourselves within the context that is related within these verses, I think that if we were in that same position as those hearers of this parable, we would probably not understand the words that the Messiah was saying. We can even see that later on within these verses, the disciples didn't understand all the parables that the Messiah was saying. However, one aspect that draws my attention and that also teaches me of how we should act as true disciples is that the disciples of the Messiah, they didn't settle for anything, but rather they investigated because they wanted to understand the truth. They desired more of the truth. And this is the attitude that we must have as true disciples of Yeshua. We must not settle or remain in ignorance, but we must go out to our teacher to learn and grow spiritually. Continuing with verses 10 to 17, we will be reading about the reason why Yeshua spoke in parables. It says, Then the disciples came and said to him, Why do you speak in parables? Verse 11, and he answered to them, To you it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For to the one who has, more will be given, and he will have in abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. Verse 14, Indeed, in their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled that says, You will indeed hear, but never understand, and you will indeed see but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and with their ears they can barely hear, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Verse 16. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Verse 17. For truly I say to you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, and did not see it, and to hear what you hear, and did not hear it. In these verses, or in these words that the Messiah says within these verses, we can realize that the people who were in this crowd were blinded spiritually, because although they could see physically the miracles and they can hear all the words, the teachings of the Messiah, however, they could not perceive that Yeshua was the Messiah that had been promised to them after Moshe's death. And we can find this promise in Deuteronomy 18, verse 15, where it says, Adonai will rise up for you a prophet like me from among yourselves, from your own kinsmen. You are to pay attention to him. The reason why the people of Israel were blinded to recognize Yeshua as the Messiah was because it was a judgment for their unbelief. And this judgment began when the people of Israel left Egypt. As it says in Deuteronomy 29, verse 4, But to this day the Eternal has not given you a heart to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. As I had said before, the people of Israel were able to witness unique miracles and prodigies from the Eternal, yet they chose not to believe, but rather they doubted and rebelled against the Almighty. And this same rebellion continued in the times of Yeshua, because these people, they did not have a heart willing to believe and serve the Father, because they sought their own benefits and didn't want a serious commitment with the Eternal Father. It is important to know that when the soul is not willing to believe, trust, and obey its Creator, then the little knowledge that it has about the heavenly things is taken away from them, just as it happened to the Pharisees in the time of the Messiah. For although they knew of all the promises that had been given to the people of Israel by the Eternal, however, since they did not want to believe that Yeshua was the Messiah that was promised to them, because let's remember that the Pharisees, or all type of religious people in the time of the Messiah, they had their hope on an earthly kingdom. So the little knowledge that they had of the spiritual things, all of that was taken away from them, and their understanding was darkened. This becomes a warning for all souls who persist in disbelief and foolishness. No matter how much they see and they can read and scrutinize the scriptures, they do not truly understand how to change because they are not willing to fully change. On the other hand, for the souls who do want to believe, just as the disciples who knew little of the mysteries of the kingdom, however, they wanted to know more about it because they truly trusted in the Eternal. They were given even more discernment to be able to walk in obedience, doing always the will of the Creator. And in that same way, it is how we must act as true believers of the Messiah. Within the scriptures, we can read that it is prophesied what would happen to the people of Israel because of their unbelief and stiff heart. In the prophecies, it says that they would not receive the blessing that the kingdom of the Eternal would be established in their lives. But in payment to their foolishness, they would find themselves reproved before the Eternal, since the religious leadership was totally opposed to Yeshua. However, the disciples were very blessed because they were able to see, and not only see, but also hear the time of the coming of the beloved of the nations. Since, or the reason why, was because they had a humble and moldable heart to receive the kingdom. Another thing that we can read in these verses is how Yeshua mentioned that the prophets and patriarchs wanted to live in that moment in order to be able to see the coming of the Messiah. But this was something that they didn't get to see in person. But however, as it says in the book of Hebrews, they died in hope. And although they didn't see it in their time, they didn't see this promise being fulfilled in their time, yet we can read that they believed it and greeted it from afar. Reading all of this, it makes me come to a reflection that it is precisely faith that makes the difference within our lives. Because we are all given as souls, we are all given the opportunity to hear, but only those who believe, who truly believe, and who truly want to obey their Creator, their lives are transformed and they can now approach their Creator of their soul without any type of impediment. Just like it says in the scriptures, blessed are those who receive the understanding and guidance that the Father gives through His Ruach HaKodesh. From verses 18 to 51 of this chapter 13, we can read about the meaning of the parable of the sower. The meaning of this parable is divided into two sections, or into a lot of sections, sorry. The first section that we find is the explanation of the sower. And this parable describes that there were 4 different types of people who sowed the seed in 4 different types of land. The first land was next to the road, which this land was a very busy land where birds can easily come and eat the seed, or the animals can step on the seed, or the people can step on the seed. And this happened because the land is not, or that specific land was not a correct place to sow that seed or plant that seed. And this land of the road represents a person who is far from the instruction. In other words, it does not believe or understand the word of the Eternal. And when it hears the word, it does not care about it, which is why the evil one takes it away because there is nothing to hold it back. The second land that is mentioned within this parable is the rocky ground. This is a shallow land where the seed is dried by the sun. And this refers to the person whose afflictions rob him or her from its joy and therefore cause the word and the faith to dry up in his life. The third land that Yeshua mentions was among the thorns. Once the seed is planted in this land of thorns, it steals the nutrients from the plant and does not allow it to grow. The same happens with the desires and riches and the materialism of this world, which they drown the believer's faith and they blur its focus, which is from the heavenly promise. The fourth land that Yeshua mentions is the good land. And this land is capable of overcoming all types of adversaries because the plant has a firm root. From this, we can learn that in that same way, we must be as believers, always trying to be that good land that remains in the eternal and bears many good fruits. In these verses, we can read about 2 other parables that Yeshua talks about. The first parable is about the wheat and the tares. The second parable is about the net. And in both of these parables, we can learn and find the reference of 2 groups of people. The first group that is mentioned are those people who are planted by the Messiah, who believe and obey the Eternal Father. On the other hand, the second group that is mentioned are those, or refer to those people who are planted by the evil one, who pretend to be believers but really do not believe or obey, and their end will be to be taken to the lake of fire. But on the contrary, the true believers who are planted by the Messiah are that good wheat that will be gathered in the great final harvest, and will dwell in the eternal mansions. And this is something that's going to be fulfilled in the second coming of the Messiah, where he is going to bring the great judgment of all creation. Another parable that we can find in these verses is the parable of the mustard seed and yeast. And within this parable, we learn that it alludes to the work that the Messiah began by bringing the message of the kingdom of Elohim closer to humanity, which throughout this time, it has resulted in good fruit, and it has also resulted in countless of multitudes of believers and servants that are willing to serve the eternal Father. The last parables that we can see within this chapter 13 is about the hidden treasure, the pearl of great price, and the new and old treasures. In all of these parables, we learn that they refer to the kingdom of the eternal, which is the most valuable thing that a true believer can acquire in their lives. And there is nothing that compares to this promise, since everything else is worthless before all of the heavenly things, just as we can read in Philippians 3 verse 8. It says, "What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Yeshua HaMashiach as my Savior, for whose sake I have lost all things. I consider them garbage, that I may gain Mashiach." In the last verses of this chapter, we can read that the people of the city where the Messiah grew up were surprised by his acknowledgement and the works that he did. But we can read that although these people, seeing Yeshua's good works, they chose not to believe in him due to their disbelief. And Yeshua, for this reason, it is why he did not perform many miracles in that city. In this, we can see that these people were deprived of possessing further revelation due to their lack of faith. The teaching of this entire chapter 13 is that the emunah, or faith, is essential in the life of the true believer, because without the faith, it is impossible to please the Creator and therefore receive his revelation in our lives. Continuing with chapter 14, verses 1 through 12, we can read about the death of John the Baptist. And this person we have already studied before in chapter 3. And in this chapter 13, we're going to read about his death. This person, as we have already studied, he was known for the action that he would do of baptism, or in its Hebrew name, tevilah, which consisted of a physical immersion in living waters. And this was a reflection of the internal change of that person after their repentance, or in its Hebrew name, teshuvah. As we have already studied before, in chapter 3, John the Baptist was chosen before his birth to fulfill an important role that he took among humanity. And this was announced by the prophets as the voice that cries in the desert to prepare the way of the Messiah. And this was fulfilled when the Messiah, or when the time of the Messiah would come, and he was now the Messiah. Yeshua was now going to be continuing with what John the Baptist had started. And all of this, we can read about it in John. We're going to read about it later on in the Good News of John, chapter 3, verse 30. As I had mentioned before, these verses recount the tragic death of John the Baptist. And the reason why John the Baptist died was because he exposed the adulterous life that Herod led with his own brother's wife. In other words, with his sister-in-law. The reason why John exposed this sin was because within the Torah, we have already studied that these actions of adultery had to be punished with death. And we can find the consequences that the people would receive when doing these actions of adultery in Exodus 20 verse 1 and in Leviticus 20 verse 10. When John the Baptist denounced the reprehensible act, we can read that he met death because Herod hated him for being a blameless man who spoke the truth. This teaches us a lesson that although John the Baptist knew that this wake-up call that he was making towards Herod could cost him his life, however, he still chose his actions to be correct according to what the Torah says. And in all of this, in this action that John the Baptist did, it teaches us that we must also act in that same way, always complying with what it says in Ephesians 5 verse 11. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. In these verses, we can realize that Herod did not care about avoiding the consequences that acting against John the Baptist can bring him, since let's remember that within the people of Israel, John the Baptist was considered as a prophet. However, influenced by his concubine, Herod imprisons John and subsequently orders him to be deadheaded to fulfill his word to Salome, his stepdaughter. Biblically, it is mentioned that this event was going to be a dance, but many have commented on this, and it is believed that it ranged from a simple dance by a young girl to an erotic dance. But whatever the method of dance or seduction this was going to be, in the end, it was considered as a great sin. And just like John the Baptist, many more other people from the Bible, such as the righteous prophets, the disciples, the believers, and even the Messiah himself, suffered in their own flesh for the sake of announcing the good for the people. With this, we come to the conclusion that as believers, we rely on the Messiah and his words that he said in Matthew 5, verses 10 to 12, which says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." In all of this, we can understand the importance of firmness, which firmness is something that for the people of the world could be seen as something useless or something unnecessary. But let's remember that firmness in the life of the creator, of the believer, is something greater, which this something greater is the true celestial treasure. And we can read about this in Matthew 6, verses 19 to 21, and in Matthew 16, verses 25 and 26. Nowadays, times have obviously changed, and the suffering that the disciples, prophets, and even the Messiah, the sufferments that they went through cannot be compared to the sufferments that we can go through nowadays. Although, yes, we can also suffer according to our circumstances. However, no matter what the circumstances are, we should never question the trials that we may be going through, because if we participate in the sufferings of the Messiah with joy, then our reward will be great. That is, that it would be heavenly. From verses 13 to 15 of chapter 14, we can read that a provision arises from Herod, who recognizes Yeshua as the Messiah and with bad intentions tells him that it is John the Baptist resurrected in him, which was made in a statement, or which was made as a statement in bad taste, considering that John the Baptist died under the order of Herod. In response to this sarcasm that Herod made, we can read that the Messiah did not contend, nor does he bother to explain to him. On the contrary, we can read that he decides to just simply walk away from there. The way that the Messiah acted in this situation, it becomes a wise fact that avoids strife. Yeshua always applied his own teachings to his enemies and acted just as he taught us in Matthew 10 verse 16 that says, "I am sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore be wise, as serpents and as innocent as doves." This act that Yeshua did gave rise to the fact that wherever he was, there were many people, upon seeing his wisdom, that decided to follow him, trusting that he would heal them, and thus fulfilling what was written in the prophets, and also giving rise to the following miracles that we will be reading in the following chapters. From verses 15 to 21, we can read about another miracle that Yeshua performed towards the crowd that was listening to his teachings. This miracle that we see, or that we can read within these verses, it is also known as the feeding of the 5,000, where it is narrated that Yeshua makes 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes, enough food to feed 5,000 people. We can even read that at the end of the disciples serving all this food to the crowd, there were 12 baskets full of loaves and fish that were left over. Everything that the Messiah did, including this miracle, contains more than a logical or scientific explanation for those who may try to find one, since it contains an interesting message that was being fulfilled in the time of the Messiah, which was the fact of seeing how the Messiah came to the world to rescue the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In this miracle, we can read about the bread that fed the multitude. And these breads, let's remember that although yes, they were physical food, however, it also represented the spiritual food of the soul. And this spiritual food represents the word of the eternal. And we can find this in Matthew 4, verses 3 and 4. Within this miracle, we can also read that it is mentioned about 2 fishes. And this refers to the 2 houses of Israel that were divided. One of them was the northern kingdom, and the second one was the southern kingdom. And both of these were fed by the Messiah when he distributed these baskets, or when the disciples distributed these baskets to all the multitude of the Israelites. All of this food, we can read that it ended up united in 12 baskets, which it also represents the 12 tribes of Israel. To conclude with today's chapters, from verses 22 to 33 of chapter 14, we can read that Yeshua walks on the sea. And this is a miracle very well known within the religions. And although, yes, this miracle was somewhat greater, however, its application is not literal. It has a spiritual message. Well, according to the events and elements described within this miracle, it contains a message addressed to those who, like the disciples, have been sent to bring spiritual food to the nations, which obviously was not only for the house of Israel, as we have read in the previous miracle, that this spiritual food was not only for the people of Israel, but also for the people who were of Gentile origin. In these verses, we can read that it was about the true believers, since we are those waters, as the story says, through which the emissaries cross on board the boat, which the boat represents the Messiah, but who still having protection of the boat, we are also exposed to winds, which the winds represent the unclean spirits, and we are also constantly exposed to sinking. The only way for us to not sink is throughout faith. This faith consists of more than believing, or as we have been taught in the religious systems, having a blind faith, but rather this faith implies security, fidelity, firmness, stableness, etc., in which exists the instruction of the Creator, which is practicing justice to have good works that consolidate faith in our lives, just as we can read it in Romans 1 verses 17, or as we can also read it in James chapter 2. In this miracle that Yeshua did of him walking on water, it demonstrates even more that Yeshua was the true Son of Elohim that the people of Israel expected, which is why when he declared himself as Ben Elyon, the Israelites considered it as blasphemy, and this not because Ben Elyon didn't exist, but because they did not believe that it was Yeshua. Because of this, it is why only the true disciples were able to see Yeshua as the Messiah, as the Ben Elyon, and therefore it is why we can read that they decided to serve him. With all of this that we have read in chapter 13 and in chapter 14, we can come to the conclusion of the importance that as true believers of the Messiah Yeshua, we must make sure that our faith is not diminished, or that we may not be having a blinded faith. Because like we have studied within these chapters, when our faith is firm, it is secure, it is immovable, it is stable, etc., then that is when we can understand the parables and teachings of the Messiah. And therefore, we are able to apply all of these teachings to our lives, just as we can read that both the Messiah, like the disciples, did in their lives. With all this, we can understand the importance of taking all the parables of the kingdom that we study, that we scrutinize, that we analyze, and so that in that way we can be fed, or it feeds us with the instruction, and therefore we do not sink in the stumbling rocks of the nations. And well, this is all for today's video. Thank you so much for taking your time during the day in analyzing and scrutinizing these chapters along with me. If you have any questions or any comments, feel free to leave them down in the comment section down below. Once again, thank you very much and have a blessed day.